Well, Jack, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming back for day two.
Well, thank you for doing day two.
Um,
There were a lot of days in between.
yeah, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I wanted to start today focusing on scholarship. We've talked a little bit already about some of your work, the Lawyer Professionalism book, for example, and some of your your early work. But why don't we go to the time when you first came to Mercer?
Okay.
And talk a little bit about the direction your scholarship took, and then we'll just follow it on from there.
Okay, good. And it really did grow out of those early experience. If you remember, I came to Mercer as director of clinical programs, and as I had been at Antioch doing postgraduate work in clinical legal education, and so Mercer hired me to direct the clinics. There's a story behind that, but I won't do that. So I had to set up courses, and there wasn't a whole lot of guidance for it at the time. I had the luxury of having a 12-hour clinic course, 12 hours of credit, 6 hours each semester, same 12 students. And I did it as what people came to call lawyering process course. The name lawyering process comes from a book by Gary Bellow and B. Moulton, who were at Harvard and Arizona, I think. Gary was he was the head of clinics at Harvard. And that book, at least in my opinion, was the first book that took lawyering seriously as a subject for study. It was divided up mostly into tasks: interviewing, counseling, negotiation, trial practice, problem solving, and so forth. And studied each one of those tasks, often, since there was little literature within our profession, by reference to other professions. So when he talked about counseling, he and B would talk just as much about Rogerian counseling, psychological counseling, and the way that might be applied in the law, and especially the techniques that they use, active listening and things like that. All of that was brand new and was revelatory for me. So that kind of identified for me the field that I wanted to study, and to think of lawyering in that way. Now, I don't know if you remember, but back at Antioch, Russ Court and I had developed this competency-based education model. And I put the two things together, the lawyering process approach and then competency-based education, as a way of evaluating and talking about it, and then comparing students who were performing radically different tasks. And that then directed my scholarship and thinking about lawyering in a more serious way. There was plenty of early literature. In fact, years later, I put some of that literature together in a symposium edition for the Law Review, where lawyers were giving bar speeches at annual meetings and talking about the profession, especially the ethics of the profession.
Yeah, you mentioned that last time.
Yeah, and so there had been that kind of talk for a long time, but this was, for me at least, this is the first time people had gotten serious about these tasks and wanted to think of them more analytically, I guess you might say. Well, during that process, I found a book by Tom Schaefer, who had been the dean of Notre Dame, and it was on interviewing and counseling. It was a completely different approach to interviewing and counseling than anything I'd seen before. Interviewing and counseling wasn't even a subject in legal education. Tom was writing about that based on experience that he had in seminars that he would conduct on interviewing and counseling with a limited number of students. One of them he was doing in England, the other he was doing back in South Bend. And what Tom was doing is taking those subjects and letting them expand into broader questions very naturally. So the student would come into the course thinking, well, I'm going to learn how to do an interview, and that's true, but not realizing that learning how to do an interview and trying to decide what a good interview was and what you were trying to accomplish in an interview and the relationship you were establishing with a client and what kind you wanted and so forth led to questions about lawyering that the student may or may not have, likely not have, encountered in other places in the law school. So the subject kept expanding in a very natural way, and that had an influence on me. I thought that's how it ought to be done in clinics. You let the students bump into a problem, and then you show them how interesting that problem is and how important. So I contacted Tom and told him how much I enjoyed the book, and asked for his, he had a teaching manual for it that he had just typed out himself. And he sent that to me with a lovely note. And that was important to me. I was just beginning in my career, and to get this note from Tom and to get his encouragement to stay in touch with him and to try out ideas and the like was like an introduction to the scholarly community in a way. And I did that. I stayed in touch with Tom. In fact, I just got back from South Bend. I was doing a seminar with Robert Audi, a philosopher up there, just a one-day thing, and they had a dinner for me, and unfortunately Tom's health is such that he couldn't come, which is a shame because I really wanted to see him again, but he's in very bad shape. But we have stayed in touch over the years, and he's been very important. One thing that Tom did, Tom is a Catholic, he was at Notre Dame, and he didn't exclude that from his inquiries. So when he was letting those questions naturally arise in interviewing, some of those questions would end up being theological, and that was welcomed. That was a surprise to me. There was no one doing that. So I started thinking about lawyering in that way, and started writing about it. Right about that time, in that way. It was about the same time that this idea of professionalism was becoming prominent, and so I pushed it in that direction. It was a nice fit. Now, through Tom, Tom introduced me in letters, we exchanged a lot of letters. Through Tom, he introduced me to the work of Alistair McIntyre, who's also, wasn't then, but is now at Notre Dame, but Alistair's in about 84, 85 years old. And also to a theologian, Stanley Hierwas. I think I mentioned Stanley before last time. Stanley, too, was at Notre Dame, but then left to go to Duke, and he stayed there. He retired last year. And their work became very important to me. McIntyre, as you know, by introducing to me the idea of a practice, thinking of legal practice as a practice in philosophical terms, like you might think of bricklaying as a practice, and the ethics of practices. It was a modern Aristotelian approach that I found very appealing. It was not the sort of examination of the ethics of the profession that was common at the time, which was, I'm going to throw out this ethical dilemma to the students and we'll talk about it. And some will be over here and some will be over there, and I'll say, hey, that's it. You know, we've done our ethics. It wasn't that. It gave a more structured, it was a functional way of thinking about the ethics, and made a great deal of sense to me. I didn't contact Alistair. I did later on, many years later. And it was unusual that I didn't, because most of the people I read that I liked, I got in touch with one way or another. And their responses to me and their willingness to let me join into their thinking buoyed me so much. It was, my goodness, these folks are honestly interested in what I'm saying, especially Stanley. So I was thinking about this, the ethics of the practice, examining the practice and the more
Well, I
serious.
just want to note, I mean, this is an unusual direction for a young legal scholar to be thinking, first of all, about the subject at all, about lawyering and what it means to be a good lawyer, but then to introduce a philosopher into it and a theologian.
It's because there weren't people within legal education who were saying much of interest. That seems strange now because there are plenty, but at the time there just weren't. When I go around to conferences and the like, I don't do the legal ethics so much anymore. I'm interested in other things that we can talk about later. When we used to go to legal ethics conferences, I would say half of the people there would express their indebtedness to Tom Schaefer for having introduced this world to them. And since Tom's thoughts naturally led to theology and naturally led to philosophy, I'll say this, and I would say at the time, he didn't do either one of those well, but that wasn't it. It was the fact that he did them at all, and that it was legitimate to do it because Tom was doing it, and he had, after all, had been the dean at Notre Dame. So,
by the way, you're the one who introduced me to Tom Schaefer.
So
his work
good,
anyway. Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about all of this and Tom's terms, McIntyre's terms, and he had introduced me to Stanley Hierwas. And I read an article by Stan about Albert Speer, who had been Hitler's architect. And I was disappointed in it. I just loved Stan's thinking, thought he was brilliant. But I was disappointed in this one. Well, along about the same time, I got an invitation to go to Nebraska as a fellow in a postgraduate program in professional ethics. This was paid for out of guilt money that a corporation gave the University of Nebraska for some wrongdoing. They said, well, we'll fund a professional ethics program. And this was going to be done by Robert Audi, who was an analytical, very analytical moral philosopher working also in epistemology, which is how do you know things, and other fields as well later on, religious speech and the like, but primarily in moral philosophy, and is really the modern father of moral intuitionism. So we went out there, and there were a few people from the legal profession, there were a few people from the press, there were a few people from business, there were some from medicine, engineering, and the like. And we spent a month in conversation led by Robert. It was wonderful. It was really a breathtaking experience. Robert was so good. Robert had this ability to take whatever you were saying, give it back to you in a better form than you had given it to him, and then respond to it and take you along every step of the way. I'd never seen anyone with the ability to do that the way he could. So I'm out there, and we're expected to do a paper at the end, and I did one, and it was raising a question that had haunted me of the difference between role morality and personal morality. There was something, speaking of moral intuition, that just struck me as intuitively wrong about that division as applied to the practice of law. That if you divide your world up that way, you're doing a disservice to both of them.
Yeah, basic notion being I'm one person. When I'm a lawyer, I'm another person when I'm a home,
Yes.
as a spouse or a parent or whatever.
And if you do it that way, all of the ethics reside in the personal role, which then stands in judgment of what you're doing as a lawyer and further divides you. It seemed to me that there was, and this is part McIntyre influence, that there was a vibrant morality within the practice of law that at times was even more demanding than personal morality would be, and that by placing all of morality into the personal, you were taking that from the law, making it what you didn't want it to be, which is just technique. So I was thinking along those lines. I put together a little something, presented it out there, and it went reasonably well. At the time, I was wondering why the personal morality was so appealing to everyone. And it was because of a liberal individualism, this sense of complete autonomy, and a misunderstanding of what morality is, I thought. And I wrote it in terms of James Dean, because it seemed to me everybody wanted to be James Dean. Everybody wanted to be this kind of rebel. All right. Well, when I read Stanley's article, I thought he was doing something similar. He was doing it from a theological point of view, but it was in a sense this rebelliousness against our roles. It occurred to me, since he had written about that in terms of Albert Speer, that I could do the same. And I did, and went after Stanley a little bit. This is before I knew him personally. I just knew about him. And that article, it's called Rebellious Ethics, got a great deal of attention. I ended up saying, and this was counterintuitive, that Albert Speer didn't need to be a better person, he needed to be a better architect. That there was within architecture ways of dealing with Hitler, and more so than he had available to him as Albert Speer, the person. And that made quite an impression on a lot of people, including a person who later became the head of the Methodist Church, Bishop of the Methodist Church, who read it and contacted me and then wrote an article about it and said, this is right, and so forth and so on. I sent it off to Stanley, and I got back this letter within days, and said, this is brilliant. You're absolutely right.
What a generous, gracious thing to do.
And I thought, oh my goodness, I can just stop now. Because that's enough of accomplishment for one life. Mm-hmm. But it was the beginning of a long friendship at a distance. Stanley had the great misfortune of being named by Time magazine as America's greatest theologian, or best theologian. And of course in the interview he said theology is not a category to which the word best applies. But because of that, so many people wanted a piece of Stanley and tried to get in touch with him. And had to set up screens, secretarial screens and everything, and you no longer could just reach him by email that had come along by that time. And he would always send me drafts of pieces that he was working on, but even that it got too much because there were thousands of people. But we've always stayed in touch, and over the last 10, 15 years, stayed in touch at a distance, maybe exchange of letters or emails once a year or something like that. But he was enormously influential.
We can go back for a minute to this notion of role morality and the professional morality. And in one of your works, you wrote something that has stuck with me, which is that part of, in effect, becoming a professional is you submit to the moral authority of the practice.
Yeah.
And that runs counter to this liberal tradition of autonomy and,
yeah.
You know, I have my own ethics and nobody can tell me what my ethics are. Does that fit in what you're talking about?
Exactly.
And when you say it's...
We don't want anything to have moral authority over us.
Well, I know students don't.
No, they don't. Yeah, they really don't, and yet they do.
Well, what they say, of
Yeah.
course, is that I have my own ethics, and who are you to?
Yeah, and they'll also say that they think of morality as something being imposed upon them.
Right.
But that's the difference between, in Joe Vining's terms, the authoritative and the authoritarian. Morality can be authoritarian. It can be offered that way. But it can also be authoritative, where it tells you something that is true about you, and you act upon it for that reason. But that sort of thinking about morality gets lost. I mean, it was routine for students, if I just used the word moral, this is in the beginning.
Right.
I got better at it later on. But I also was at times intentionally outrageous to try to get them to stop thinking the way that they were thinking. But they would routinely say, well, you can't impose your morality upon me. And my response was, well, you just did that in that statement, right? Why can't I impose my morality upon you? The implication of your statement is that for me to do so would be wrong. Wrong in what way? Immoral. So what you are doing is imposing morality of universal tolerance on me in making that statement. You can't avoid it. It's what you mean by the word moral, is that it has some authority over you. Now, impose is the problem, not moral. It's the way in which you do it. And what I want to do is show you the morality of the profession that will be attractive to you. Attractive, it will be something that you want to become, that it's there. That's how you get into the practice. That's how you get into the ideals of character. That's how you get into the questions of the good. What does it mean to be good? And it's taking those things seriously, especially the good. It's difficult, though, because those are cultural entities. They're not physical in this way, and we have a hard time taking cultural entities seriously.
Would a good way to say it be that morality is there within the practice?
Mm-hmm.
The practice has defined it.
Mm-hmm.
It's our job to help them discover it and see if they adopt it and, of course, change it.
Yes, that's it. That's a very good way of saying it. It raises the question of what do you mean by there and what form does it take? It's not a physical entity,
Right.
and yet it's grounded in our perceptions. So it's hard for people to make sense of it. It hasn't always been the case it's hard, but since scientific materialism has so dominated our thinking, it's very hard for people to think in those terms. I'm jumping way ahead, but
Right.
one way that it occurred to me to get people to think in those terms is music. Because in music, and in other forms of art too, but just more direct and more the experience of law students, in music you experience something like that, something that is out there, not physical, and yet very, very real. It's those forces within music that you feel, which are so much more than just emotion. That, there's a sense of direction, there's a meaning, there's everything else, a shape. And so I could talk about it in music and make that analogous to the problem.
We've talked about it in a lot of different ways: music, baseball,
Yeah.
other ways. But I think I interrupted you.
Well, let me get. You mentioned the baseball. Let me get to that part of it, because in some ways that comes next. But I'm trying to make sense out of the ethics of the practice and to ground them internally to the practice. And again, I stumbled into. I don't remember. It was another theologian, a friend of Tom's that Tom introduced me to. It all comes back to Tom in a way. Oh gosh, Pat, I've gotten so bad with names, it'll come to me. Anyhow, I wrote to him, and he wrote back and said, well, I really like what you're doing. Let me recommend a book. and it was a book that influenced him in the section of, he wrote a 3-volume work on theology that really begins in the narrative, begins in people. It's a rigorous theology, but its starting place is with people. So anyhow, he sent me this book. The book is called The Grasshopper. And it's by a philosopher, but it's not written as a philosophical word. The grasshopper is the grasshopper of, is it the grasshopper and the ants? The story, the fable, where the ants are working all the time and the grasshopper, the world owes me a living, and yeah, okay. It's that. And he is, although he only says this in the beginning, the book is done in a light-hearted, it's serious work, but it's done in a light-hearted way. He's responding to a problem that Wittgenstein noticed, that Wittgenstein said we cannot define what we mean by game. We can only know game like we know faces, and that's by family resemblance. So stop trying. It's an attack on analytical philosophy, in a sense. Well, there are all sorts of problems. The part in German, the word for game is the same for play, and that changes things a great deal. But he's writing, and he's trying to show, yes, we can. We can define game. Now, whether he's successful at that or not, responding to Wittgenstein, I don't know. But what I liked was the way in which he defined game. And it was by reference to what's called a illusory attitude, where you accept the rules of the game because you want to play it. And those rules are constitutive rules. They constitute the game. Just like in baseball, you can't run from first to third and call it baseball. The requirement of going to second base is a constitutive rule of baseball.
I think you described it, and probably he described it as that built-in inefficiencies or built-in obstacles.
Yes.
And that's what makes the game.
That's right, exactly. And if you remove those, you destroy any reason that you might have of playing the game. So if I'm going to run around the track, if I move the end of the track up to 1 foot in front of me, I've got a remarkable time, but I've got nothing out of that at all. So that idea, I said, ooh, combine that with practice, but let's think then about what we are doing in the practice of law in these game terms, and think of these ethical rules as primarily constitutive rules for the legal conversation.
Okay.
And you wanted to ask me.
Yes, and I want to say one thing first, and then I want to ask you this question I told you I was going to ask you. I can hear immediately, and of course you address this in your writing, but let's talk about it. Hear immediately the indignant objection that you would describe the practice of law and all of the serious things that it deals with, money, property, life, death, freedom, as a game in a lighthearted sense. Now, you don't mean it that way, so I want to give you a chance to...
Okay, well, I wrote an article trying, it's not the article in which I do the game stuff best. That article is the cheating article.
Right.
And I think that's one of my better pieces. But in a subsequent article, I tried to track an understanding of justice itself as a form of play. And in that article, it's not a direct defense of my prior use of the expression game, but it shows you how serious games are. And how this game became as close to a sacred game for us as we are capable of, and the history of that as it developed out of the Greek. And so there's historical justifications for describing this as game. and I tried to lay those out. There's another philosopher, Huizinga, I'm sure that's a terrible pronunciation, who's done a great deal of writing about games and their importance and their centrality to ethics and the like. And so at least in ethics and in other fields, that question wouldn't really arise. It wouldn't arise in economics.
Right.
It wouldn't arise it does arise in politics, but
For example, game theory in economics is not
Exactly.
treated as that's something lighthearted.
That's right.
It's powerfully explanatory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
this is game theory, if you want, in ethics.
Well, you mentioned this term, legal conversation. And,
Yeah.
and I know that is central to your work. Our friend Professor Jones described it to me as one of the major themes of your work
Yeah.
over the course of your career. And I don't think that that's a phrase that has an immediate meaning to most people.
Yeah, I
And so
don't know.
I want to give you a chance really just to explain what you mean by the legal conversation.
Right. I think in part that was a reaction to what James Boyd White calls language. He was primarily interested in the language of the law. And there's an awful lot to that, and I love Jim's work, and he too becomes terribly important. We can talk about that later on. But it didn't seem to me that language was having the impact on students and others and that captured what it was that trying to be communicated. It's very important. It was important to Stanley too to think of the law as carrying with it a language, holding on to the meaning of terms like murder. And doing that for the entire society. So there are these words like murder, and lesser terms obviously, that don't just fall apart when we think about them. There's a way of continuing to define them that makes sense and is a serious discipline inquiry. And in that sense, the language part is great. But notice that it's really about the preservation of a conversation as much as it is about the language of that conversation. So when I wanted to talk about the conversation, not just the language that conversation was responsible for. And by conversation, I meant something very broad. It was not just the conversation that was going on at trial, thinking of trial as a conversation, because it included the conversation between the lawyers on the opposing side. It included the conversation with the judges on appeal. It was all of those conversations that together responsible for the way in which we do justice. I guess I'd want to say it that broadly now. Probably wouldn't have said it that way then, but I would say it that way now. And that that conversation, one way of thinking about it, and I'm having some questions about it lately, but I still think it's right, is that that's a conversation that we engage in as an alternative to force. So, and this is in one other article, it's when there's a fight just around the corner, that's the time that we say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to talk. And we're going to impose that upon ourselves, that this is how we do it as a community, as a culture, and so forth. When this happens, rather than fighting with each other, rather than making it political, which is another way of fighting with each other, we're going to talk. That the law is the great, but stop and think about what you're going to do, but stop and think and talk about what you're going to do. And that the legal profession's great gift to the world is that conversation. And our ethical responsibility is to it. That we can understand our ethics best by seeing the things that we are required to do as a matter of ethics as those things that maintain that conversation. Now, you could set that up, and some people did when I described it that way. It's, oh, well, no, this is Monroe Friedman. No, it's not to the conversation, it's to the client. You can't divide it up that way. The responsibilities you have to the client are responsibilities that also maintain the quality of the conversation, because we want every voice within that conversation to be heard. They're not heard directly. They need to be translated, but that's because they're translated into the shared language of the law. Yes, Mark is right that legal conversation became the best way I could think of understanding actually all of those things I've already described. The constitutive rules are rules there to maintain the conversation.
One of the connotations to me of using conversation as opposed to language,
right,
is the capacity for growth and change.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, yes.
Is that part of what you're trying to capture with that? Is it by virtue of the conversation, the law itself and the role of lawyers evolves and changes?
Yes. Now, I think the language does that as well, but I can understand why you would say what you did, because we don't tend to think of the language in that way. We do think of conversations.
Well, language, of course, evolves as well, but
yeah,
just
right.
The connotation of those two words
Yeah,
in
yeah.
contrast to each other. Is what I
Yeah.
meant.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I did, and this is probably puzzling to people, I typically talked about the legal conversation in the way I just did, but there's also an internal conversation within the practice of law, as there's an internal conversation within baseball or any other practice that's necessary for the maintenance of the practice. And those conversations, that's one thing that I wanted the students to see, that it's not fixed, that what we mean when we say the practice of law is not something fixed, that the status quo is not static, it's forever changing, and that they will become, by entering into the internal conversation of the practice of law, they'll shape it, and they'll shape it in their own way. Yeah.
Okay, well, once again, I interrupted you to ask you about the legal conversation. So you were talking about your earlier work on using the game
right.
Terminology.
Yeah, well, I don't know how much more I want to say about that. We the cheating article, the thought occurred to me that if ethics are primarily constitutive rules of the conversation of the practice of law, then a violation of ethics should be understandable in terms of cheating. Just like we'd say, going from first to third is cheating in baseball. Disclosures of confidentiality, cheating. That conflicts of interest, cheating. That some of them are obvious. That ex parte contacts with judges, cheating. And that I thought, there may be a limit to this, but I thought you could apply the idea of cheating to all of it. And in the beginning of that article, I listed about 20, 30, 40 different things and said, these are all just examples of cheating once you accept the description that I've offered. And then the rest of the article just explaining how that's true. The problem is that no one ever talked about cheating. It had gone missing from legal education almost entirely. And if you lose that, you've lost the understanding, I thought, of the practice of the law in which those ethics made sense. It makes a great deal. No one has any problem with saying that, what's the pitcher? Yankee pitcher that he had the substance on the neck.
Had the pine tar on his neck.
Yeah. Panetta, is that his name? Mike Penn, something like that. No, people understand that's cheating, you know. And you don't have to go much further with the analysis. It's because people accept that there's a game there that has constitutive rules that we want to play that ends up being terribly important in the lives of some people, not just those that play it, and so forth and so on. And I want to try to get students to see the practice of law in exactly that way. Notice the difference in motivation. Ethics is now, this is back to your question, morality is now not something imposed upon you. It's something you want.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, that's one of this really, in many ways, amazing insights in that particular article. That article's meant a lot to me as I've tried to teach,
oh, good. Thank
teach
you,
our
Ken.
students. But the notion that the desire to not cheat, right, is something, that's inculcated in you because you're becoming a lawyer, you're becoming part of this,
right,
of this game, in a sense. You would want to obey the rules because they are the rules, right?
That's right.
And that's who you are.
That's who you are. And it really, then, legal education should be thought of as a sort of an initiation into the practice. We had stopped thinking about it that way. Notice, you cannot think about it that way if you see your moral standing and judgment and if you don't think of yourself as a lawyer, which so many of the students didn't. Understandable.
Right.
But didn't.
And you can't think of it that way if you look at legal ethics as disciplining lawyers for violating written rules and the codes of conduct.
Can't do
Because
it.
goodness gracious, you can get away with murder.
And there's something, I think, even more important.
Yeah.
That and gets back to the idea of conversation. Tom Joyce, who is a lawyer downtown, he does a lot of Social Security disability work and a lot of other things as well. He was a second baseman at, maybe a shortstop, at Furman. I coached over at Vine Eagle for 3 years and then took a 1-year break and then coached again after they moved over to Morgan Field. I know all those terms make sense to you. The 1 year I didn't, actually it was 2 years I didn't, is because Tom was going to coach the team. And I really wanted Lanier to be on Tom's team, to have Tom as a coach. I could help out, but Tom was the guy. Now he was strict disciplinarian with the team, but he was the guy who knew baseball. And there was so much that I learned about ethics from watching him coach these kids. We're getting ready to go into the postseason playoff stuff, and they're matched up in different ways, and it's done as a random thing, selected, drawn out of a hat or something like that. And people were up there chatting. They'd just been posted on the board, and people were up there chatting, and there's something, oh no, we got to face such and such a team in an early round. That's really tough. And Tom listened to this. He listened to the kids talk this way, and the parents too. And Tom listened to this for a while and just couldn't take it anymore. He said, y'all are missing this. We want to play against the best team. We're baseball players. We want to play against the best team. And we want that team to be full strength. We don't want them to have an injured player. We don't want to win any of those ways other than being the best baseball team. That made quite an impression on me. And apply that to the practice of law. It says that if ethics are the way you and I were describing it, the other side is not the enemy. You don't want the other side screwing up. Yeah, it's a fierce competition. You want to beat them, no doubt about it.
But they're necessary for you to
They're
play.
necessary for you to play, and they share with you this ethical obligation to the maintenance of the conversation itself.
And that's where the surprising notion of cooperation.
Right.
comes in with,
It is surprising,
yeah,
isn't it? Yeah.
an adversary in a game. So
Yeah. But you know, most lawyers end up over time knowing that. I noticed in the paper today that the DA here was applauding the work of two defense counsel in a very difficult matter. And that's exactly the way it should be, because a good DA would know that he or she is dependent upon defense counsel like that for the quality of their own work and for justice being done.
You know, at one point, I heard you say, and I think this was in the context of a lecture rather than to me directly, but I heard you say that you had worked on these questions of legal ethics and lawyering and for years and years and years, and you finally got to the point where you said what you wanted to say.
Yeah.
And then you moved on to other things.
Yeah.
Is
I'm
that-
sure there's a lot more to say. I just reached
said what you wanted to say.
where I got to where I think what I said was that I got the course. That the great puzzle for me was, what in the world am I doing in this course? I was teaching in the clinic. We're all the way back to that. There was an opening in teaching what they then called legal profession, to teach ethics. And I thought, well, that's kind of a natural fit, and they're looking for someone, so I'll do that. Did all my own materials for the first 5-6 years. All the time trying to figure out, what is this course about? And it was after maybe 20 years of trying that I did the course once when I thought I got it right. And I knew what I was doing, and that most of the things I tried worked, and the students, I thought, learned what I was hoping they would learn. And it's pretty much at that point. It wasn't that I had figured everything out, it was just that the course worked. And so I moved on to other things. But you remember when I said that one important influence on me was the fact that for Tom, starting with the simple task of interviewing, what people thought was a simple task of interviewing kept expanding, 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 expanding. And suddenly, what was, how do you get a good chronology out of a client in an initial interview became this ontological puzzle. Legitimately, where the students had good reasons for wanting to solve that puzzle, personal reasons for wanting to solve that puzzle, real and immediate to them. Well, the same thing was happening to me. I started thinking about things outside of the ethics. The relationship of legal ethics to the theology became much more important to me. That was prior to time when I did the seminar here on theology of legal ethics. That was, in some ways, a central event for me. And then through theology, back into philosophy, but not just moral philosophy. The connection between theology and philosophy is close and getting closer, especially over the last decade and a half. So it led me in that direction. It was more to questions of justice. I've done it in this conversation. I was using justice as a sort of a fallback. Well, that's what this is about, justice. What does that mean? Lawyers don't like to use the word because we're responsible for it.
So, if I've got the timing right, I mean, that you really made this shift about 10, 12 years ago in your, both in your teaching and in your writing.
Yes.
And I don't want to leave the earlier phase if there's anything else you think we need to talk about in terms of your writing about, the legal profession and
I can't think of anything. But I did. I stopped teaching the legal ethics course and started teaching First Amendment courses Mercer was very good to me in that way. I got to do 2 small courses, one focusing on the free speech, free press clause, and the other on the freedom of religion clause. So the courses worked together, and the research that I was doing and the like fit together so nicely. And let me be clear that all of this time, almost all of this time, I'm also teaching evidence. And I probably enjoyed teaching evidence as much, as not more, than anything else I was teaching. As trial evidence, taught as a problems course. It was a lively conversation in a large class. I put them in the role of lawyers with evidentiary objections and responding to it, and trying to unpack the federal rules that way, but also teach them as an introductory matter a little bit more about trial. I always had Daryl haunting me as I was teaching, because these are the students that are going to go into her, and I don't want Daryl telling me that they don't know evidence and that they don't understand trial and so forth and so on. So that's going on, and in fact, while I got an awful lot of calls from former students and others, especially from the bar for one reason or another, on the legal ethics stuff, and that most of my bar work had to do with legal ethics stuff, I really got almost as many evidentiary questions from former students, and interestingly from judges, and then worked with a couple of judges on their own scholarship on evidence. So especially Ashley Royal, who taught here, but has also done an awful lot of scholarship on evidence and knows evidence rules well. And so I've left that out of the story entirely, and I shouldn't have. I left out because I didn't write about evidence.
Well, we're going to talk about the teaching side of it here a little bit later this morning, so we'll have a chance.
But yeah, I moved into that, and that raised a whole set of different questions. The theology stuff became even more important since we were talking about freedom of religion. And it was about that time that, through Robert Audi, who I've already mentioned, I got pressed into working on what's called the publicity of reasons, but in a particular form. Publicity of reasons means that do you have to offer public reasons for a position you hold? Translate that into the question of, in religious speech, in a political context, must you offer shared reasons? Or can you say, no, I think this because God told me? Well, Robert wrote a book about this. It was controversial at the time. And I got asked on numerous occasions to respond to Robert, but also just to talk about that issue. And for a while there, he and I did kind of a dog and pony show, going around to a couple of schools, and he would offer his and I would offer mine. We did one of these, and this was highlighted at Oxford on a conference about the publicity of reasons. And that was such a terrific experience. Got to eat at the high table, and you're surrounded by all the dons and the like. And but yeah, though there was that. And let me back up, because I think we're losing the narrative a little bit. The ethics questions, back in the practice of law again, led eventually into theology questions. And that was really the progression.
How do you make? I mean, what about the ethics scholarship and the scholarship about the profession leads you to theological questions and into this question of the theology of the practice, which was the symposium you did 12 years ago?
Well, it said the theology of the practice, which meant that, and this still seems true to me, that traditions carry with them theological implications. Practices carry with them theological implications. Some would say ontological implications. If this is true, then this is the way the world is, those kind of implications. If there is such a thing as music, we are a certain kind of people, and that's an ontological claim. So the notion was that I'm not imposing theology on the practice, that there is a theology there that hasn't been unpacked. What is it? Tom, early on, will talk about it as a service profession in theological terms. We're servants. And he would see it that way. And that's fine. That's a good way of doing it. But I didn't see that the practice was so much thinking of it that way. So what is it? What are the theological implications of offering to the world a conversation in lieu of force? What are the theological implications of holding on to this language in which we can have these conversations? What are you committing? What kind of world are you committing yourself to when you say that this is a good thing? That this is the way we should do justice. If you don't bracket God out of that, which we do, but if you don't bracket God out of that, those questions are there almost on the surface. But because we bracket theological inquiries out, they're not. There's at the beginning of the symposium on theology of the practice, I wrote a little piece, and it just as an introduction, and it talks about the way in which we identify lawyers and these ideals of character and so forth. And I tried to show there how that's also a theological question. And that's what this conference is about. Now, some of the people at the conference, Walter Brueggemann, Joe Vining, Dan Edwards, of course, and others took to that immediately. And some, interestingly enough, Jim White, resisted. And it's taken me a long time to see why Jim resisted. He did an excellent piece, and in the conclusion to the symposium edition, I wrote things that are primarily in response to him. It's mostly because, and I say it's interesting that he would be the one, because Jim is now not a Eucharistic minister in the Episcopal Church, and he is that, and he's also a deacon, but he's in a unique position where he's allowed to preach, and he preaches at two churches most Sundays, not all, and has 2 books of his sermons out. So he's a very deeply committed religious man, and always has been. Never in public until he retired, and then it became public. So it was interesting to me that he was the one resisting, but I think it was because he's so anti-theoretical and was afraid that it was going to be talk of theology and lose its grounding in the particular situation of particular people, which is his forte.
Yeah, it might be a good time for us to take a break and let them change the tape, and we'll come back and talk some more.
Okay.
Okay.